Welcome, everyone. You're listening to Biotech Hangout, a live and unedited weekly discussion of all the latest news in our industry with a group of biotech insiders. I'm Daphne Zohar, and my co hosts today are Josh Schimmer, Tim Opler, John Maraganore, and Paul Matteis. For more information about our hosts and guest speakers, or to listen to the most recent episode, please go to biotechhangout.com. We're going to start by talking about the macro and current biotech market environment. Biotech stocks have been up in the last week, except for today a little bit. Since bottoming on April 7th, the XBI is up about 15%, and the BBC, which tracks small and mid-cap biotech stocks, is up 30%, though these indices are still down around 12 and 24% for the year, respectively. The recent rally has been attributed in great part to the recent comments from our new FDA Commissioner, Marty Makary, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But the sector has underperformed for years, and the last few months have been very tough. I was pleasantly surprised to see that even Adam Feuerstein, who has been writing about the gloom in the sector, wrote a positive piece called Sunshine Days yesterday, where he quoted Tim. We haven't seen much M&A, but we did get another takeover rumor yesterday, Merck KGaA to acquire SpringWorks in a $3.5 billion deal. That is a slight premium, but well below what they were trading at in February. So let's kick it off with Tim and then go around. Tim, what do you think? Do you see some green shoots for biotech? You're on mute. Okay, while he's getting off of mute, maybe Josh, do you want to start it off?
Sure. I mean, it's hard to call them green shoots when the XBI is struggling to get back to its highs from earlier this year, highs from last year, highs from 5 years ago. I think we are a sector that's consistently optimistic about the future and hope for the future, and proud of all the innovation that is occurring in the sector. But on the other hand, there are powerful forces that acting to constrain spending on biopharmaceuticals, which in turn act to constrain investor interest into the sector. And so, I guess the shoots are less brown than they've been lately. But again, it's hard to be overly optimistic in the context of an XBI that's been so sluggish for so long. The XBI being a very good gauge of generalist interest, and the fact that generalists just don't find this space appealing. That's a topic I think we may get to a little later.
Thank you, Tim.
Daphne, can you hear me now?
Yes, you have a little bit of background noise, but we'll try to ignore it. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. So I think things are never quite as bad as they seem, and maybe never as good as they seem when times are good. And so, look, the bottom line is we've got plenty of fundamental innovation going on, but we've had a backdrop of high interest rates, a president who has been unpredictable and creating a lot of uncertainty, an FDA that's gone through some cuts at a time when we're facing competition from China. So, not surprisingly, the XBI's been down and people in the sector haven't been doing great. A number of hedge funds have been under a lot of pressure, right? So you're seeing some pressure selling at the same time that all of this other stuff is going on. The reality is that the FDA, I don't think, is going to be nearly as bad as we think. And in fact, I personally think the FDA is going to be a positive tailwind for the sector. We saw a very good inflation report. Our president is, clearly playing a game of poker with tariffs and doesn't actually intend to impose these, insane tariffs. And so I think in the last week, things have just been, and that's why the XBI is up. And it doesn't mean that, everything is great and sunny. I agree with you, Josh. But I do think that we're seeing very positive signs in the last week.
And maybe I can add, Tim, I think the big difference in the last week is just some of the names that have been trading better in the space. I mean, you saw biotech trading well innately is risk on, but you can even see, a lot of the micro cap names. We've got some that are up 40, 50%, names with early stage technologies and very little data, and names that are more levered to a more lenient FDA. And just in my investor conversations, I felt like for the past month, there was just a very, very high concentration of interest in like 5 or 6 stocks that I cover that are all, de-risk asset names or commercial or companies that clearly have no financing overhang. And it feels like the interest is broadening a bit. Now, granted, this is with specialists. I'm not saying generalists are trying to buy the next gene therapy story, but as much pain as some specialist funds have been in, I do feel like there's less defense on the investing side and maybe a little bit more offense right now.
Thank you. So I'm going to summarize the Makary interview and then I'm going to ask John to comment. So I watched the Makary interview on Megyn Kelly Sunday morning. That was like what I did on my Sunday morning. And I thought there were some important positives, including a commitment to expediting the drug approval process. He questioned why it currently takes 10 years to bring a drug to market in the US and expressed urgency to shorten the timelines due to patient needs. Makary also gave a few examples of what they plan to do, including, I think this is the part that was probably viewed as very bullish, requiring only one randomized controlled trial and then following that with intense post-marketing surveillance based on EHR data. He made the distinction of calling out VAERS and FAERS as being unreliable, due to being based on self-reporting, and talked about EHR data and the ability to mine that better. He also acknowledged that there's privacy issues, which they're going to address. With regard to rare conditions, he noted the potential for conditional approval based on a plausible mechanism, even without a randomized study. There would then be monitoring after based on health record data. He also talked about reducing animal testing requirements by using technologies like organ on a chip, predictive in vitro modeling, and AI in the review process. The FDA, under Makary's leadership, recently announced a plan to phase out animal testing requirements for monoclonal antibody therapies and other drugs. He noted they plan to improve on bureaucracy by reducing red tape and eliminating internal silos and fiefdoms. And there were also a few areas to keep an eye on. He said he wants American pharma to do well, but scientific analysis should be independent, and said that they're going to be replacing pharma representatives with patient family representatives on advisory committees. I'm not sure how big of a change that will actually be. And then he spent a lot of time talking about areas that are less relevant to us, like food and environment, and their plans to eliminate ingredients like banning food dyes, which we just heard about, and then microplastics in seed oils and the microbiome he talked a lot about, and reducing the overall administration. And he claimed that no cuts were made to reviewers, scientists, or inspectors, and that cuts were made only to communications staff, FDA lobbyists, and outdated IT staff. But that doesn't necessarily gel with what we've been hearing from some biotech CEOs. I have to say that my own personal N of one experience is that the groups we've been interacting with are functioning well and meeting timelines, but this has not necessarily been the case for other CEOs in biotech. John, you've talked to some of the CEOs that have had issues following the recent changes at FDA. Can you comment on that and also the very well-researched article in BioCentury this week?
Yeah, I mean, look, I also found the Macri interview to be encouraging. Net. Megyn Kelly made me cringe, but what Macri said was, I think, encouraging. And there were really good words that he used. Want pharma to succeed. He used the innovation word, which is always great to hear from policymakers. To some extent, he sounded a lot like Peter Marks and some of the things he was saying, which I think is good. But obviously, it's encouraging. Obviously, we need to see that whatever this rebuild and all these new provisions are put together, it's going to be super important that they maintain scientific standards and independence from political influence. And I think that's going to be something to watch for. But to your point, I am involved with a lot of companies and I see a lot of different things. It's a bit of a tale of two cities, I would say, across my universe. I see some companies that are experiencing delays, and yet others are even experiencing accelerated responses. I had one friend of a company running a company that submitted a protocol amendment and received a response within 24 hours, which is amazing. It's a bit all over the place right now. There was a very interesting issue regarding the Vanda CRL appeal that happened where the FDA themselves said that the nature of the appeal delay was related to staffing and the recent reorg and recent disruption. So it's obviously indisputable that the FDA acknowledged that. point. So I think we have to take note of that as well. Um, so yeah, that's my general response on the ecosystem. And the point on the Steve Woosden article that came out this past Tuesday really focused on this planned reorg of the FDA, which it was a very well researched article, not as is often the case by Steve Woosden. Um, that talked about some of these structural changes that are being proposed, and talked to former leadership like Janet Woodcock and Rachel Sherman. And I think the key message out of that was the important need for really thoughtful considerations around some of these changes and also change management as to how these changes are done. So, hopefully the commissioner will take note of these in terms of the actions that he takes on.
Yeah, and another area which has been a little bit of a headwind is the threat of pharma tariffs, which remains uncertain. We heard some announcements from big pharma companies about expanded investments in the U.S., in U.S. manufacturing sites, and the topic of tariffs came up in adjusted earnings and revenue predictions during recent earnings presentations. Industry lobbying groups, some of which you and I, John, are involved with, are advocating for other non-tariff incentives for onshoring manufacturing. So we'll see how it all plays out. I'll open it up to the group to comment on what you're hearing about the impact of tariffs. Let's maybe start with Tim, and then the rest of the group can comment.
Look, I think pharma tariffs in theory could be a pretty rough thing. And I think it's very much atmospherics that we're watching. In other words, Trump is using the threat of pharma tariffs to encourage onshoring. He's also very focused on pricing differentials. The same drug sells for one price in the U.S., sells for another price in Germany. He would like to see that narrowed, and I think you're going to see some onshoring take place, and you're also going to see actions take place on prices. And I fear that it's going to be bad for drug access in countries that are not as wealthy as the United States because pharma companies are going to be raising prices in other countries, from what I'm hearing from my friends in large pharma. I did want to comment a little bit on what, John, you said on the FDA. This is the big driver of stock prices right now. Biotech just took off this week, and it was driven, I think, very much by the FDA comments. And I specifically was on a panel yesterday with Naomi Lowy, who was recently the associate director of CEDAR. And so she spoke extensively on what was going on. It sounds like she has many contacts still inside the FDA. And her comments, I think, were incredibly relevant to the Usden article and very much at variance with the message in the BioCentury article. So just to summarize some of the things she said, first of all, the reason that 25% of FDA reviewers essentially recuse themselves from reviewing things, which is obviously what's behind these companies that are experiencing delays, is because they were told that they needed to be in the office 5 days a week. She said at the very moment this happened, all of these kind of Doge people started showing up at the FDA who obviously had no knowledge or qualifications of actually looking at this as an organization. And she said, oh, and by the way, the FDA has 2,000 reviewers who are physicians. They chose not to be physicians, instead work in a regulatory agency for the public good in general. It's not like these were the washout physicians. And so she said it was very offensive. And so people just said, you know what, I'm going to look for another job. She said in her own case, she was required each week to send in a list of the 5 things she accomplished that week. So in her last week on the job, her 5th thing was, I found another job, accomplishment for the week. And so
Wow.
she said, right. So she said, those guys are all gone, right? Makary is there. Makary's a reasonable guy working with the leadership teams, and people are coming back to work. The first thing Makary said is, you don't actually have to be in the office 5 days a week. You can come in 3 days a week, but please don't, make it Monday and Friday that you. In other words, don't give yourself a 4-day weekend, please. Um, and so morale is changing very, very rapidly at the FDA. And there's some very big changes coming, which were hinted at in Makary's interview. We're under some confidentiality obligations, but just to say, just watch out what happens in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And we're going to start to see companies um, that are going to be getting approvals with relatively small data sets, as long as those data sets are decisive and involve rare disease situations. So it's going to be a very interesting time for the biopharmaceutical industry, and I'm very bullish on what's happening at the FDA.
Yeah, and one other positive thing that I forgot to mention was the recent executive order, which addressed the pill penalty. And I think that was viewed as positive because there's a belief that it might address the 9 versus 13 years. So the 9 years for small molecules in the IRA. Anybody else like to comment on tariffs, FDA, or anything like that before we move to some data?
Well, I just maybe just to follow up on Tim's comments, it's great to hear that. And as we all know, journalists are fantastic at what they do, but and they're important as always. But they also will talk to certain people and maybe get a perspective, and it may not be the complete picture, if you will, and that's just natural. I, for one, net am feeling positive about the FDA as well. I just want to make sure that the net benefits of some of these, forward-leaning policies, as long as they're science-based, will accelerate innovation getting to patients, while the, potential impact of these changes and staffing and so forth don't slow that progress down. That's all. And let's see where it goes. I'm net optimistic, but I think we have to see how it plays out for the rest of the year.
Great. So we're going to move to some data, but we'll come back to some of these bigger themes, including short selling and tips for CEOs and things like that. So, but let's start with some data. Paul, you cover a range of neuropsychiatric companies, and you had a very good KOL call this week, which we listened to, where you talked about a number of them. Can you touch on any notable items from that? And also would love your thoughts on the Cobenfy Arise study results and how much they impact the potential for the drug.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the the most interesting thing from this KOL call to me, and it almost kind of requires you to zoom out, is that there is just a lot more optimism that psychedelics in psych are real drugs. Some of the KOLs have experience with Spravato from J&J and talk about how that's not fully a psychedelic because it's a safer drug. But if you just zoom out, Spravato is a really challenging product to use. It's an every other week antidepressant. There's dissociation, inpatient monitoring. The efficacy of it is okay. It worked in half its studies, and yet there's 50,000 people on it, right? And it's growing growing very fast. J&J has made a lot of investments in building out the infrastructure. And so just as we think about psychedelics as a class, I still think investors are looking at a lot of the companies in this space with real caution and real skepticism. And, there's the kind of whole stigma around it, right? But, at the end of the day, I mean, we had someone from MGH who they have a psychedelic center. I mean, the physicians are getting ready to use these drugs. And even though there's nuanced differences between them and certain complexities, like I just kind of keep coming away from some of these doc calls and thinking, you know what, like investors, because look, the backdrop, Daphne, is a number of these companies in the psychedelic space are not trading, that much above cash, maybe, 2 times cash or things like that. And so it just continues to be super interesting to me. As it relates to Cobenfy, so the context is Cobenfy is off to a nice start. First quarter beat numbers reported by Bristol this week. We had covered Karuna, covered Cerevel. I follow Neurocrine. Like our expectation had been that this muscarinic class can be a blockbuster class easily in schizophrenia with upside and other indications. But there was a setback that has, I think, nuanced implications where Bristol reported that the adjunctive trial, this is combining Cobenfy with another antipsychotic, failed this week. And when you look at the data, there's a signal, but it's a pretty modest signal. And it's not entirely clear why the study failed. Bristol did an analysis excluding patients on one atypical antipsychotic. And when you look at that, there's a bigger effect size. But in general, the benefit is just not that big. And so, when we had covered Karuna, our view was that this study could have a pretty significant ROI if positive, because this would have been the only drug that has a combination label in all of the schizophrenia space, right? And being able to have that marketing angle as a novel mechanism could have a lot of power. Conversely, though, I still think, and the physicians corroborated this, I still think that Cobenfy is going to be widely used as a combination product. And I still think when push comes to shove and psychiatrists think through the options that they have for the tougher to treat schizophrenia patients, what other choice do you have other than to try multiple medications in someone who has failed, two, three, four drugs? And right now, about a third of patients with schizophrenia are on two atypical antipsychotics, even though those types of drugs have overlapping side effects and overlapping mechanisms of action. So the actual biological rationale to combine those drugs for additive efficacy is so. And so, I think for Cobenfy, the headline here looks negative, and but it is negative, but this isn't like other areas where you've removed an indication expansion option. Because if you look at like the depression space, for example, I think Axsome's combination study was negative, but what you hear from most docs is that they use it more often as a combo therapy than a monotherapy. And so I still feel like the bull case for Cobenfy is intact, and I thought our physician panel this week echoed that.
Yeah, and I think they needed to run this trial for several reasons, primarily to establish that Cobenfy was safe to administer in combination with traditional antipsychotics, since in the real world, this is how the drug will be used in combination before the traditional antipsychotic is tapered off. It was interesting. I was looking back, and there was a Jefferies analyst that asked them on the last earning call, why wouldn't the probability of success for this trial be more like a 50-50 coin flip, since these studies are pretty hard to run. And I was also reading a little bit about some of the sales assumptions, I think, which are very much in line with what you're saying. Citi actually removed completely adjunctive schizophrenia from their peak sales assumptions, and that brought the sales estimates to 2.8 billion from 3.4 billion. But they noted that Alzheimer's psychosis could bring it back to 5 billion in peak sales, and then William Blair analysts estimate peak sales of about 3.7 billion without the Alzheimer's upside potential. But anyway, it was, I think, in many ways a disappointing result, but not entirely unexpected. And it sounds like it's being viewed as incremental. Paul, you've also been following the uniQure breakthrough therapy designation announcement. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, aligned with what we were talking about the Makary interview, this was a really interesting update, and it has implications, I think, for the broader gene therapy space. If you take a step back, right? I mean, gene therapy has been out of favor for a variety of reasons. One being, I think there's a lot of investors who are still or becoming more skeptical of the launch model for these products, although it's in our view it's really disease dependent. But nonetheless, I mean, one of the overhangs for this space has been that under Peter Marks we saw a bunch of gene therapy companies align with the agency on pretty favorable regulatory setups, right? You can look at Rocket, who's doing a 12 patient pivotal study. And you can look at how Sarepta got approved in DMD on pretty mixed data, a bunch of other examples as well. uniQure had been talking about being able to potentially file on the comparison of a phase 1/2 study for their Huntington's gene therapy versus natural history. And for context, that study did have a placebo arm at 1 year, but there wasn't much separation. We can debate why, right? It might be because the drug's not working that well, or it might be because in Huntington's patients progress pretty slow in year one, and you're not really realistically gonna improve people that much on the drug arm. And so the natural history comparison that they show at 2 years, and we'll get 3 year data this year, looks pretty promising with 80% disease slowing. But I think, the street was pretty heavily discounting this after Peter Marks left. And I think we've seen a greater discounting of other, gene therapy regulatory alignments and things in rare disease like that, like Denali. And so this uniQure breakthrough, I think, is a big deal because, breakthrough essentially shows that the FDA views the data as promising, and also they announced breakthrough after Peter Marks left, right? Which aligns with what uniQure had been saying, that they believe their regulatory alignment was not Peter Marks dependent. They believe it was deep within CBER and the division, and so I think it's a big deal for them. The next catalyst there is they're going to have 3 year data. They're also going to have an update on the exact statistical plan and how they're going to do this sort of primary registrational analysis between phase 1/2 and natural history. But also for me, I mean, it makes me more confident that for other companies in the gene therapy space, the regulatory flexibility bull case may still be on. Daphne, are you on mute?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Uh, Thank you. So, Josh, you've been tracking the American Urological Association conference this weekend as J&J and CG Oncology are facing off in non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. Can you tell us more about it? Oh, it looks like we might have lost Josh. All right, we'll skip to the next topic and come back. Um, so let's actually talk about the Tim. Stifel had shared a biotech market update that included details on what's happening on the buy side, and you were talking about a Cantor associated piece on short selling. Can you share more about that now? And I'll try to figure out what happened to Josh.
Yeah, so Eric Schmidt from Cantor put out a really interesting report on short selling on Monday, and unfortunately he couldn't be on, but Josh is going to be his representative once we get him back. So I'll talk a little bit about the Stifel study. And so once a year, what we do at Stifel is we look at the buy side in biotech fairly comprehensively. There's two types of data that we look at, and I want to be very careful in kind of identifying what they are. So once a year, if you are a registered investment advisor, which almost all biotech hedge funds are and long only funds are, you have to file a report with the SEC in which you disclose your assets under management, AUM. Assets under management could include cash, long positions, and also short positions. By the way, you could even go buy like dry cleaner stocks or whatever. So you can, whatever you do is going to be in your AUM. At the same time, we also looked at biotech holdings. So how much long biotech positions these funds had. So a couple of very interesting things came out. The first is that as of last year, so this is 2024, that the net biotech holdings of specialist funds went down. That is, the long positions went down. But the number of funds actually went up. And the assets under management of those funds was essentially unchanged. So, if you will, specialists went a lot more short last year. And then, if you look at which funds actually lost AUM and which funds gained AUM, this is where it gets interesting. It's very relevant for Eric Schmidt's report. What we saw was that the funds that were able to do long short or were able to do multi-strat either stayed the same or gained assets on average last year, whereas the funds that were long only, not surprisingly, on average lost assets, and that's of course because it wasn't a great year last year, and so it's it's very relevant when you sort of think about all this shorting activity. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? The other thing that was interesting, and I don't want to dwell on the companies that lost some assets, but there were a couple like in the past we've talked about Armistice, right? So they had like massive asset outflow, which was very visible in all these data. What was interesting is to look at the companies that gained assets, and we tend to focus on the bad news in our sector, especially these days. But there were so many groups that gained assets, and so some of them were smaller, high-performing hedge funds groups like Catalio, 8R1, Silver Arc, Darwin. And then the other thing that was interesting to me is that some of these groups that will play in the public space but are like more PE or venture focused did really well. So Forbion gained huge amount of assets last year. Sofanova Partners, French company, gained a lot of assets. Patient Square gained huge assets last year. And so you hear the message, which is it feels like, gosh, we're in this existential moment. Is biotech viable? Actually, our sector is doing just fine on the asset manager side. It's just a lot of folks on the specialist side went short. This has nothing to do with Q1, which is what we're living through sort of right now in Q2. Is it's been kind of bumpy, although it feels like things are turning. But the specialist investor was in good shape on average coming into 2025.
Josh, can you comment on this report on short selling?
Yeah, sure. So I think Eric kind of goaded me into taking a very different position and conclusion. He kind of pointed his finger at the hedge funds, opining on how their short selling was a powerful external pressure to an already fragile industry that maybe the industry would be better off without. I think for me though. That the hedge funds are basically doing their job. I mean, that's what hedge funds do. They long and they short, and that's part of the capital markets. And in biotech, you don't get to pick and choose what part of the capital markets we want to apply to us, because some may be inconvenient. And there is a reason why the XBI hasn't gone anywhere in 5 or more years, and there's a reason why many companies trade below cash, because it's not like they're ever really going to give that cash back to investors. It's more like prepaid expenses. So maybe instead of referring to it as cash, if we just referred to it as what it really is, for the most part, prepaid expenses, we wouldn't really look at that as any relevant metric whatsoever. And the reason that the industry is struggling is it's like literally everybody's fault aside from the hedge funds, right? The sector is very complex, it's very volatile, it's full of failure, it consumes a never-ending amount of capital in fairly inefficient ways. It almost never returns that capital to shareholders. Very few companies have a truly sustainable business model over the long term beyond one or two product successes. And few have a business model that can account for patent cliffs, and now the IRA as well. And on top of that, now we have competition from China. So we've created this wonderful industry of innovation, but we've created it in a very vulnerable, fragile way that does attract short investors and does not attract generalist investors. And that's okay, right? I mean, the sector is what we make it to be, but we can't necessarily lament how the capital markets may be working against this sector, and we cannot lament that generalist investors aren't coming along to save us, and we can't lament that pharma companies aren't coming along to save the entire industry. It's an industry of some winners and a lot of losers. And if you're a very skilled, thoughtful, and experienced investor, you can do quite well in terms of generating returns. But again, it requires either a lot of skill, experience, and a little bit of luck, or less skill and experience and a lot of good luck to thrive in this world. So it was kind of a fun back and forth to write with Eric.
Yeah.
And Josh, Eric was really saying, hey, like some of these companies are so vulnerable, maybe the shorting really is destroying companies. I don't doubt that there's a biotech or two that's been crushed by short sellers. Uh, but your point is so well taken, which is there is a free market process that attracts capital, and sometimes that's on the short side.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'll comment as well a couple of points. The point about generalists and not having as many generalists attracted to biotech recently, I think there's also some practices like the wall cross pipes, which I think tend to make it even harder for generalists to understand the industry and do well. So, if a wall cross pipe happens and the financing happens before the data are announced, you don't get that sort of big stock appreciation that you would get in the absence of that. I mean, obviously, what would happen then would be the financing would happen after the data, and that also creates some downside once that the financing is announced. But in general, the wall cross pipes have been, I think, very negative, and there's other examples like that. And then I'll just make a point as a CEO. I've always felt like short sellers are actually kind of a positive influence in some ways, in that they, if they come into your stock and then you have positive news, you basically get some really great appreciation for the stock when they have to cover. And in general, I think they keep people kind of focused on what the downsides are. So if you're running a company and you're doing well, I don't know that they have that big of an influence. So they can manipulate highly illiquid stocks. Does anybody else have any comments on the short selling phenomenon and the comments that were just made? No. All right. Well, we're at the risk of touching on a third rail topic. John Maraganore and Tim, in the email thread leading up to this, mentioned that this topic of Trump versus universities like Harvard has some implications for our industry. John and Tim, do you want to kick it off? John first.
Yeah, let me kick it off. I mean, I think everybody's seen the news reports of government actions toward universities like 388-year-old Harvard. actions toward, academic research institutions. And we're now even seeing reports, again, in the media of actions toward venerable research journals like the New England Journal of Medicine. And in some cases, or maybe all these cases, maybe in some cases, these actions are purported to be linked to intolerance of anti-Semitism, which I completely agree with, and also to DEI practices, which are grossly disfavored, unfortunately. And some of us may question if those are really the real reasons that are going on. And I don't actually think we should discuss the reasons for these actions. It's, I think, outside of the scope of a biotech hangout discussion. And I think people on this call probably all have very personal views, on this matter. And I don't think we should talk about it, but we should talk about what does it mean for our industry, regardless of the merits. And I do think we need to talk about that because I am worried about these actions, whether meritorious or not, having an implication on US competitiveness, US scientific excellence. There are China implications as it relates to this growing competitiveness of the Chinese biotech sector, which is, I'm sure, surprising all of us. There are medium and longer term impacts. I don't imagine that these government actions will have any immediate impact on biotech companies per se, but there are certainly medium and longer term impacts of this because, after all, academic funding is the top of the funnel for all of our companies' innovation for the most part. Then there are implications for freedom of speech and peer review and so forth, preeminence of US journals. I mean, the list goes on, and I do think we need to be conscious of it just to understand the implications. Should be able to talk about it freely and openly, and also, consider how we as an industry need to respond to these type of actions. And so, Tim, I don't know if you want to add any more context to it, but we can go from there.
I mean, John, I think I'm on your side on this one, and probably even more strong views. So I just want to make 3 points. The first point is that our industry grew up around academic institutions. It's no secret that, the biotech ecosystem in Boston came out of Harvard and MIT. It's no secret that the strong biotech ecosystem in San Francisco came out of Berkeley, UCSF, and Stanford, right? And so those institutions are ground zero for our industry and continue to be important sources of innovation. It's nice that innovation is democratizing. It's not all Harvard and UCSF at this point, but those are very important institutions. My second point is why is Trump doing this? Does Trump actually, you know, think that Harvard is out of control or what have you? And I think it's very important if you look at some of the intellectual underpinnings, if you might say that there are some, behind sort of the modern populist conservative movement. And when I say that, I mean a lot more than Trump. So, like in Hungary, we have Viktor Orban, who has made a massive assault on academic freedom. And so, what's very interesting is if you search a man named Antonio Gramsci, who's actually a Marxist theorist of all things, he's very well studied and very well liked by the right wing. Gramsci just makes a very important point, which is culture and academics are critically important to controlling a society. In other words, if you want your party to have influence on a society, you need to influence through cultural means, which we see in things like social media, and you also need to have influence on the university system. So, what to someone who's grown up as, thinking about the Enlightenment and thinking about liberalism, it seems like an assault on academic freedom or freedom of speech to someone who is focused on a political control, um, being able to cause those institutions to be more compliant is actually very important. And of course, another very important aspect is Trump is playing to his base, right? So he's trying to appear to be combating, woke people in these institutions. And I'm sure there are some people that have, you know, points of view that are very different than the majority of our society, but isn't in a way that's supposed to be kind of the idea of these institutions. My third point is where this is all going to end up. And there are a lot of discussions of NIH cuts. They haven't happened, just to be clear, but those could be profoundly harmful to our industry because NIH research is kind of where a lot of biotech gets started. But I do think that it's very noteworthy that Trump's standing in the polls, even with his own supporters, has really plummeted in the last month. And just like we're sort of seeing him back off on tariffs, which has been very good for biotech, I do think that these conversations about Harvard and so on, I hope, maybe that's wishful thinking, will end up being more like the conversation we were having about Greenland or annexing Canada 8 weeks ago. It's really more a conversation with this base than a real intention to restrict academic freedom at Harvard University. That's my hope.
Yeah, thanks for setting that up. And, I think that if we look at that Grachi framework, the counterpoint really is that these elite academic institutions like Harvard have been accepting large sums of foreign funding from governments such as Qatar and China with limited transparency. And Qatar, for example, has poured hundreds of millions of dollars into American universities, often through unrestricted gifts or targeted research centers. And these funds aren't purely academic in nature, but they're actually strategic investments to shape ideology. And this influence has supported a strong atmosphere in the case of, one area, anti-Semitism or racism, which would probably not be, I don't think that would be acceptable to most people if it was targeted at Black or LGBTQ students. So I think what's most troubling about this ideological drift is it's not limited to fringe voices. It's being normalized in classrooms, student organizations, and faculty circles. I do think that with regard to the universities and how they're managed, it does raise the question of how these universities are handling the conflict and how do they work with the administration, which is a major funding source, just like any other funding source, to try to address concerns while maintaining academic freedom. But I think it's important to note that they're not entirely free. They're taking money from other places as well. Josh, do you want to comment? And then I definitely want to make sure we talk about advice for CEOs and one other data point before we close the show. Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know if anyone's read the actual legal brief that Harvard submitted as part of their litigation process, but it acknowledges how horrible anti-Semitism has been on its campus. Honestly, my social media feed is filled with this. I'm surprised that the topic of anti-Semitism is so easily cast aside. Um, and the legal brief admits they have a long way to go to be compliant with the laws. It lists some of the actions that they've taken to protect Jewish students on campus, and honestly, I find them quite laughable. I suspect if you went and asked Jewish students at Harvard if they feel safe and protected now after some of these responses, they would still say no, as evidence of the fact that Jewish enrollment in Harvard is plummeting to near all-time lows and at an institution that has always had a reputation for not being friendly to the Jewish community. And so what I would say is let's hope Harvard figures out how to get its act together to protect its minority groups, all of them, not just selectively, but minorities, including Jewish students. Let's hope that they do that so that they can not only keep the $6 billion of annual funding they still get from the government, but the extra $2 billion that was stripped away, in addition to the $50 billion of endowments that they have, the student tuitions, and all the foreign funds that they're happy to accept. So let's go Harvard. Let's go to all the other Ivy Leagues who are tolerating the anti-Semitism on campus, so that there's no longer an excuse for the government to strip away their funds.
And I again, I didn't want to get into the discussion around the merits of all this, and you and Daphne bring up amazingly important points, which I completely agree with. At the same time, we have academic institutions that are central to our industry, and we just cannot. We must find answers here that preserve them, that preserve the value that they bring to our biomedical research enterprise, to our competitiveness as a country. and we must get through this without decimation of the amazing institutions of the academy at the end of the day. And
Oh,
I think we all agree with that.
100% agree. And I think that there would be nothing better than to see these very powerful scientific constituencies of these elite universities actually stepping up and forcing the universities to protect the Jewish community, and in doing so, protect them as well against these fringe groups that have become so disruptive. 100% agree. It is time for everyone to really step up and put an end to the tolerance of these activities. So, John, to your point, and Tim, to your point, these absolute pillars of academic innovation for science and beyond can continue to thrive.
Great. We agree. We
Well, this
agree.
is this is a great topic, and you know what I love about our industry is that we can talk about tough topics and disagree and listen to each other and learn. And I really wish that in general, that was the dialogue that was happening more broadly. So, thank you, everyone, for the commentary on this topic, and I think it was important to touch on it. Josh, I know that you're going to have to jump right at the top of the hour. We got a little bit of a late start, so we're going to continue past one. But before you go, do you want to talk about the American Urological Association conference, J&J and CG Oncology facing off?
Yes, I would love to, because we're now a year past the 2024 AUA that started this whole battle in motion. J&J's TAR-200, which is a drug device combination that's inserted into the bladder for treatment of NMIBC, came out swinging a year ago with very strong projections of what their 12-month complete response rate was going to be. CG Oncology at the time presented data that was much more mature, and at the time, it looked like J&J's TAR-200 product had a CR advantage at the 12-month time points, but it was a bit of an apples to orange comparison because one data set was much more mature than the other. And this has been a debate that we've basically been mired in. I do cover CG Oncology for the past year. The CG Oncology bulls, suspected as the data evolves that CR advantage that J&J has over cretostimogene, CG Oncology's product, will contract to the point of essentially being irrelevant for clinicians, whereas Bears have noted that the delta, which is close to 10%, maybe a little lower, it actually got narrower at ESMO of last year, so kind of as the J&J data matured. It looked like they still do have a CR advantage, at least at that point. And this has been something that, again, for the last year since last AUA, has been a topic of intense debate. Who's got the higher CR rate? So Saturday, we're going to put this argument to bed, hopefully, because we'll have full mature data from both companies presented in back-to-back plenaries, and then hopefully we'll be able to move on from that battle, hopefully start to think about the very vast unmet medical need that these patients have. They do need multiple options to keep their disease at bay for as long as possible before they wind up requiring a bladder resection surgery, which is very invasive. Um, we may now roll over this who's got the better CR rate into the 2-year follow-up, and kind of playing the same playbook that was laid out at AUA last year. We'll see if that's something that we do have to deal with. But I think from my perspective, eager to get past this weekend, so now we can stop this kind of very short-term focused who has the higher CR debate, and now start to talk about what the treatment landscape may look like with two really good options coming to patients.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Josh. So we talked a little bit about short sellers. We talked about the industry and how tough it is. I can tell you guys that I'm part of a number of different CEO groups. Obviously, Bio. John and I are on the board of Bio. I'm involved with No Patient Left Behind, which is an excellent organization that I recommend people look up. And then the Biotech CEO Sisterhood, which is a really amazing group of, I think it's almost 400 CEOs. It's a really tough time to be a CEO in biotech. And John, you have so much experience and insights both as a CEO and also as an advisor to many companies. You did an interview with Endpoints on CEO survival tips in this environment. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, no, Andrew Dunn did a nice story to try to, get a few ideas out there for CEOs as they think about, capitalizing their companies, getting through this current environment with capital markets being very challenging. And obviously it was good to spend some time with him and offer some learnings. The one thing that didn't come up in that though, that since we're getting close to the end of this discussion, I think is worth mentioning is the important role the CEO and frankly other leaders in companies play during these tough environments with their teams. And that's not been talked enough about, I would say. It is I had a breakfast this morning with one of my colleagues, and we were both talking about this point, and it is amazingly important for those on the call here that are either in a leadership position or CEOs themselves to really reflect on how important it is that they can help their teams through these very turbulent times. Think about what's important for the business, think about patience and making an impact, and obviously be the real leader they need to be. It's really a moment of time in which leadership shines, needs to shine. And it's an opportunity for all of us in this industry to bring in our best when we come into the office or come out to the Zoom call, whatever it is. And so I think that is an opportunity for us to help and contribute to the broader enterprise that we're all involved with.
Hey, John, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Um, if you were still the CEO of Alnylam, what would be some of your plans to position yourself, relative to some of these, potential macro changes, like something like tariffs, right? Where you want to prepare as a company. Also, changing your supply chain is a massive investment that takes time and is disruptive, and so maybe you don't want to go overboard if you don't think tariffs are going to be durably in place. But how do you stay nimble and prepared and be proactive but not reactive? Like, what would be your perspective there?
I mean, part of it, and specifically, to the Alnylam story. I mean, I would be thankful that a lot of our API manufacturing is done in the country, and just happens to be that way. Not all of it, but most of it. And I'd be super thankful that the company is close to profitability at this point in time. So, it's a very different case than some of the companies I'm helping build right now that are in very very different stages of their life cycle. But there definitely are supply chain implications even for an Alnylam raw material aspects that need to be considered and so forth that come from all parts of the world. And how tariffs will impact all that is gonna play out over time. But I do think the larger companies like an Alnylam, Vertex, Regeneron, those companies are thinking a lot about how they need to secure greater confidence in their supply chains, and they're probably investing meaningfully in securing that domicile security. And so it is a natural reaction. It wasn't just through the Trump administration, I would say, just more broadly the geopolitical risks that exist out there that were exacerbated by Russia and Ukraine and other things that we've all been aware of. It's a complex world right now, for sure.
John, any other tips that you want to share with biotech CEOs? And maybe actually, we have a few more minutes because we started late because of the
Yeah,
strange music that we had in the background.
yeah,
Maybe we'll just go around. You can kick it off, and the others aren't necessarily CEOs, but would love to get any
yeah.
tips they have for CEOs in this environment. And then we can close the room out in about 5 minutes or so.
Yeah, I mean, look, in addition to the comments I made around leadership in this period and the importance of all of the listeners in terms of how they show up in the office and how they bring their best to their teams in this environment, I do think that company strategy wise, you need to be super focused on balance sheet preservation while focusing the capital and the resource plans on the biggest value driving activities, which are often the ones that move the needle for patients ultimately. But that needs to be the core focus. You probably have to put some of your, aspirational plans on hold for a little bit. Put them either on the shelf or find a way to finance them through partnerships. I'm not a big fan of spinouts. I wouldn't do that in a heartbeat. But there are clever ways to think about business development more in this environment than before, without giving away the company, if you will. So these are all the tactics that CEOs need to, and their boards and their teams need to avail themselves of in this environment, and survive through it. We will get through it. We will get to the other side. There will be brighter days ahead. There's no doubt about that. There will be some Darwinian evolution. There will be some companies that don't make it. That is to be expected. But we will be a stronger industry on the other side of this. Better people, better science, more focused teams, that have got the experience, and so we will be stronger. And I'll stop there.
Yep. Josh, I don't know if you have a minute before you need to go, but do you want to comment on that? Advice for CEOs? No. Paul? And
I
then
mean,
Tim.
everything. John's much more qualified to give this advice than me, but I would just say, for the development stage companies, be mindful of the studies you're running and the data that you release, right? I mean, what I'm hearing from investors when they're thinking about catalysts in a market like this, especially catalysts for companies that have cash needs that might raise in the back of data, is I think it's really important for a catalyst or a data update, um, to answer a key investment question, like something that actually can materially move probability of success. And so trickling out, a patient or two of data, or an update on something where, hey, we think this looks interesting, it's promising, it's still early. Like, I think sometimes, especially for earlier companies, companies that have gone public in the past couple of years, you only get one or two chances to really have a market moving catalyst where you can actually get the attention of people, and this is a market that is punitive for data that doesn't really de-risk anything when investors think that a company might raise in the back of it, right? So I think, like, you got to hold whatever you're disclosing to that level of standard.
That's a really good point. So the point that if you put out data that is sort of marginal and not a key catalyst, people might actually punish you because they're expecting you to raise money on the other side of it. I think that's really interesting. Tim, did you want to make any comments or advice to CEOs?
I mean, I think the big lesson of the last couple of years with the China competition is that U.S. and European companies can and probably should become much more efficient. I sort of assume that that's just like obvious and everyone's absorbing it. But I actually saw a presentation this week by a company, backed by, say, five really good mainstream VCs, sort of maybe like John, some of the ones you're involved in Boston, really great people. They put up a budget showing that to get to an IND, they were going to spend $55 million. And I just kind of like was sort of in the back of my mind saying, how did this still happen? Right? I mean, they have one molecule, they knew the target, and it's 55 million from start to an IND. And so I think there's still a lot of adjustment that needs to happen in the U.S. biotech community, at least from my perspective.
Wow, that's really interesting. I think that that also aligns with some of the comments John made about preserving cash, just to be able to see another day. But I think overall this conversation brings up that there are some positive things happening with regard to the FDA and other changes. It's a very volatile time, and this industry is very important, obviously. And I hope that many of my colleagues can take some of this advice and that it will be helpful to them.